Our country has experienced all manners of challenges, crises, and catastrophes in the nearly 225 years since our Constitution was adopted. There have been floods and fires, earthquakes and hurricanes, epidemics and armed conflicts, even a civil war. Throughout, however, every 2 years our nation has collectively voted, including every 4 years, to select our chief executive. In all situations, no matter how dire, the political process has continued, and with it, the American experiment in self-government. While the gears of government may grind slowly, it can appear, as poet and editor James Russell Lowell remarked in 1888, that the design of the Constitution had created a, quote, machine that would go of itself. But a more realistic appraisal and understanding of our democracy's longevity in the face of numerous challenges is that for the gears of government to keep turning, they must be lubricated. And this lubricant, or a major ingredient of this lubricant, is the art of political compromise. In the past few weeks, we've been through a major natural disaster named Sandy and a tightly fought national election. The former presented us with arresting images of compromise, of a sort at least, of its best. For example, Republican Governor Chris Christie and Democratic President Barack Obama putting aside their differences to address the public good. Whether the latter event, the election, will produce a similar spirit of compromise remains to be seen, however. It is with this thought foremost in our mind that we are here today with a truly illustrious panel of political theorists and philosophers, and I should add, political theorists and philosophers who are also practitioners, to discuss the topic that we're here to talk about today, quote, a time to deal, reawakening the spirit of compromise in American politics. My name is Michael Deli Carpini, and I'm the Walter H. Annenberg Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication here at Penn. On behalf of the Annenberg School, the Penn Political Science Department, and the Penn Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, I want to welcome you to a very timely discussion, coming as it does just 1 week after the election and with less than 2 months until the Budget Control Act of 2011, the so-called fiscal cliff, goes into effect, or may go into effect. Those of you with long memories for political intrigue or deep interest in national politics will recall that the Budget Control Act is a federal statute in the United States that was signed into law by President Barack Obama on August 2nd, 2011. The act brought to conclusion the debt ceiling crisis, which had threatened to lead the United States into sovereign default on or about August 3rd of that year, 1 day before that was going to happen, tellingly, I think. Under the terms of the act, the U.S. debt limit was increased, and Congress was tasked with finding a solution to the country's long-term budget deficits. Failing to do so, which has been the case thus far, a series of automatic events will occur on December 31st of this year. These events include tax increases due to the expiration of certain legislated tax relief bills and spending reductions for federal agencies and cabinet departments, including defense, totaling $1.2 trillion through the next decade. From this amount, some major domestic programs like Social Security, federal pensions, and veteran benefits are exempted. The potential good news in this scenario is that should these automatic changes take place, the deficit for 2013 is projected to be reduced roughly in half, with the cumulative deficit over the next 10 years to be lowered by as much as $7.1 trillion. The bad news, however, is that these changes represent strong medicine for an ailing patient, and our already sick economy is projected to fall into double-dip recession in the first half of the coming year, if these automatic events are allowed to take place. Almost everyone, regardless of partisan leaning, agrees that this would be disastrous to the American public and is something to be avoided. In fact, the reason this was put into place was in large part to play a sort of game of political chicken that would force Congress and the federal government to act. But currently, at least, that is about all anyone seems to agree about. This is where the difficult work of political compromise becomes essential. I'm very pleased that with us today we have two noted experts in understanding how political compromise works and why it is necessary to get things done. Amy Gutmann is not only the Penn's 8th president and a noted leader in higher education, but she is also an admired and widely published political philosopher whose past works have examined the value of education and of deliberation in democracy, the importance of access to higher education and to health care, the ins and outs of identity politics, and the importance of ethics in public life. Her most recent book, The Spirit of Compromise, Why Governing Demands It and Campaigning Undermines It, is co-written with her colleague and co-author on a number of other books, Dennis Thompson. Dennis is an eminent political theorist who has written extensively about political ethics. He holds the Alfred North Whitehead Professorship of Political Philosophy at Harvard University. He is also a professor of public policy at the John F. Kennedy School for Government and the founding director of the University Center for Ethics and the Professions, now known as the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. What Drs. Gutmann and Thompson have done in this book is demonstrate how compromise works in a representative democracy and why it is so necessary. The book's subtitle on the role and value of compromise, that is, why governing demands it and campaigning undermines it, captures its essential argument as well as the timeliness of this panel. The authors point out that there is something they call the compromising mindset that is necessary for effective governing among parties that disagree. It means in the day-to-day friction of politics, you recognize the importance of respecting your opponents and, when it becomes necessary, of prudently adjusting your principles. This is how bills are passed and things get done. In their absence, it becomes virtually impossible to change the status quo, even, as we have seen, the status quo might be the government running out of money and potentially defaulting on its debt. The difficulty, according to this argument, arises when because campaigning requires just the opposite set of behaviors. In campaign mode, it typically serves a candidate best to tenaciously stick to principles and demonize opponents. In the heat of a campaign, you need to have an uncompromising mindset that rallies and excites your base of voters and brings them to the polls. But unfortunately, that makes effective governance all but impossible. The problem we face today, say the authors, is that our current political leaders have no way of turning off campaign mode and switching to governing mode. They are all campaign all the time, and the results, as we have seen all too clearly, are gridlock, dysfunction, and the failure to address important national problems. With us to respond to the book and its applicability to our current political scene with thoughts and observations of their own are two highly respected political theorists with extensive experience studying and again engaging in how public policy in America is made. William Galston holds the Ezra Zilkha Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he serves as a senior fellow. A former policy advisor to President Clinton and presidential candidate, Bill is an expert in domestic policy, political campaigns, and elections. His current research focuses on designing a new social contract and its implications of political polarization. He's also College Park Professor at the University of Maryland. Bill is author of 8 books and more than 100 articles in the fields of political theory, public policy, and American politics. His most recent books are Liberal Pluralism, published by Cambridge University Press, The Practice of Liberal Pluralism, also published by Cambridge, and Public Matters, published by Rowan and Litfield in 2005. A winner of the American Political Science Association's Hubert H. Humphrey Award, he was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2004. Professor Galston is joined by Russell Muirhead, the Robert Clements Associate Professor of Democracy and Politics at Dartmouth College. The author of Just Work, published by Harvard University Press, Russ is currently working on a book on partisanship, I think that's tentatively titled, A Defensive Party Spirit. Previously, Russ taught political theory at the University of Texas at Austin, Harvard University, and Williams College. He was a Radcliffe Institute Fellow in the past, 2005 to 2006, and also the winner of the Rosalind Abramson Teachers Award at Harvard College. Professor Muirhead holds a PhD and AB from Harvard University and a BA from Balliol College at Oxford University. So having introduced our speakers, please join me in extending a warm welcome to our authors and panelists. So I'd like to start our conversation, and let me give you a little heads up. We're going to hear from the authors have a little bit of back and forth between the authors and our commentators, giving them a chance to give their observations. I'll ask a few questions to get us going, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. So as you're listening to the conversation, please be thinking about what you might be interested in bringing to the table and to the discussion. But to start off, I'd like to hear a little bit more about our current situation from the perspective of their book. So I'm going to ask Dennis Thompson to start. Dennis, the election has just ended. The time for campaigning is over, or at least should be over. And together as a nation, we are facing an enormous and time-sensitive fiscal and budgetary challenge. Based on your book, what can we expect to happen now? Now that the campaign is over, is there any hope that we can look forward to a period of effective governing?
First, let me evade by thanking you, Michael, for the introductions and for hosting this, the Annenberg School and the Political Science Department. I'm pleased to be here. It's a break from Cambridge, Massachusetts. So the question was, now that the campaign is
what's going to happen?
What's going to happen?
Very simple question.
Can we look forward to a period of governing? The answer, I'll be unequivocal, is yes, if members of Congress read our book. But in case they don't, or at least not all of them do, here are some observations based really drawing on the book, but about what's going on now. First, three optimistic observations. The campaign is over for the time being. The chairman of the House Republican Conference just yesterday made the point, we would have quoted him if he had made it earlier, the worst time to work together on a bipartisan basis is right before an election, campaigning. The best time to work on a bipartisan basis is right after an election. Now, okay. Also, it's the case Mitch McConnell cannot say the single most important thing we want to achieve is for President Obama to be a one-term president. That's reassuring, right? Well, he could probably still say it, but the fiscal cliff with the dreaded sequester, which Michael described, suddenly seems a lot closer now that the election has removed some of what a lot of people were fantasizing as the easy ways of avoiding it, total control by one party or another. Third point, the election may or may not have been, well, it was not a resounding mandate for any particular policy. You may want to argue with that. But it certainly was a call for politicians to work together. We would even say compromise. Some Republicans, chastened by this, are even actually using the word, and not as a dirty word, which is what it was for a while. Now, there are also reasons, which you've probably already guessed, but are clear from our book. We're not so prescient as we predicted the outcome of the election. But first, the House is still very much in control of the Republicans, and most of the most conservative Republicans were reelected, and many, like your senator, Pat Toomey, see their reelection, see the House members' reelection as a vindication of the uncompromising stand that they took. So, and they still have, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to attack the people.
Toomey's after you, Dennis. There goes our power. Our power didn't go out in Sandy, but he comes here and badmouths Senator Toomey.
We're going to be doing that throughout the talk.
Every time we say something that's, I'll try to say something now unpleasant about the Democrats, so maybe if some Republicans were chastened, and I think they have been, or at least the rhetoric is, some Democrats, the other side of this, have been emboldened. They're already criticizing Obama for concessions he made the last time, and so there's a kind of shifting. It's a seesaw. But maybe most importantly, and this is, as Michael indicated from our book, a campaign may have formally ended and the campaigning mindset may be temporarily on pause. But in fact, we do live in an era of the permanent campaign. The media, which you study here in this school, covers governing as if it's campaigning, and they're already doing that. The money chase goes on. It starts the day people are in office. In fact, even before. We mentioned, we mentioned in the book, you may remember two congressmen, one Mike Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, and Pete Sessions, I think, from Texas. They missed their swearing in at the House in 2010 because they were at a fundraiser. And then they swore themselves in watching television, watching John Boehner swear the other members in. So that image of fundraising starts even before you are in office, captures something very vividly about the permanent campaign we're in. Still, I don't want to be too much of a downer. Compromise is still possible, or it may be possible under these circumstances, but only if politicians and the public restrain the campaigning mindset and unleash the governing mindset. To do that, they have to overcome some misconceptions that a lot of people have about compromise. A lot of the book is devoted to trying to dispel some of those misconceptions, to showing these obstacles that stand in the way of making compromises when they should and could be made. And so in my brief remarks here, I'll just mention two of them. The first is the idea that compromise is not possible because we're so polarized and politicians are so partisan. Undoubtedly, polarization makes it harder. Hyperpartisanship that we've heard so much about makes it harder too, but not impossible. I remind you of three great compromisers, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, who were not particularly friendly, and certainly ideologically at the extremes of their parties, got together and produced the most important tax reform bill of our time, the Tax Reform Act of 1986, a classic compromise, a mess. Logically, philosophers and people who care about coherent principles would not like it, but everybody agreed it was an improvement. Ted Kennedy and Orrin Hatch, again, standing on the wings of their party, worked together and produced a lot of legislation that we would all agree is good.
That's what happens when
compromise. Children's health insurance, protections against discrimination for people with disabilities, and a number of other things. And if you say, well, that's in the past, Dick Durbin and Tom Coburn, members of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, and they too are not centrists in their party. They managed to get together and put together another classic compromise, the framework of which probably will have to be more or less the way we get out of this mess if we do. In fact, it may be easier if you're more seen as standing for principle at the more left and right of your party. It may be easier to compromise because you're less likely to be charged with selling out by your base. The second misconception I want to mention is the assumption that compromises have to be based on shared principles, or what is popularly called the common ground. You've heard a lot about that recently. Nothing's more common than politicians calling for everyone to come together on the common ground. It's a problem. It's actually the idea that that's the only kind of compromise, or the one we should be aiming for, is part of the reason that we're having trouble getting to classic compromises. And to show you this make it vivid, I want to recreate before your very eyes an interview with John Boehner had on 60 Minutes in December 2010, just before he became Speaker. And to do this, I'm going to call back for a reappearance the best actress who we could imagine who could play Leslie Stahl. Amy, would you be willing to do that?
I don't know. I have no choice here. Absolutely.
She may win Best Supporting Actress for this, but I assure you that I will.
We're not going to act it, Dennis. We're just going to read it.
Okay.
That was the deal.
Well, it's true. We did this once before, and the moderator said that I am actually from John Boehner's district in Ohio, and I hope he said two things. He said I should get a tan more and look a little more orange, and that I should cry. I'm not going to do either of those things. Anyhow, okay. The context of this is that Obama has just been asked in an interview, how are you going to work with this guy Boehner, who you've said is a bomb thrower, and Obama says, no, well, he's going to become Speaker. He'll have to govern. So here goes the interview. Boehner, that's me. We have to govern. That's what we were elected to do.
But governing means compromising.
It means working together.
It also means compromising.
It means finding common ground.
Okay. Does that mean compromising?
I am clear I'm not going to compromise on my principles, nor am I going to compromise the will of the American people.
So you're saying, I want common ground, but I'm not going to compromise. I don't understand that. I really don't.
Well, when you say the word compromise, a lot of Americans look up and say, oh, they're going to sell me out. And so finding common ground, I think, makes more sense.
So then Stahl reminds him that he did try to make all the Bush tax cuts permanent by trying to come to a compromise with the president. So you did compromise.
We found common ground.
Why won't you say it? You're afraid of the word.
I reject the word.
That's what you do. By the way, I have a request before you go on. How about some of the people sitting in the back and the wings coming up here, coming up front? So, anyone willing to move up front?
Yeah, move up. So
Let's
we have
see.
this is
Reverend Gibson,
make for
come
a
on,
more.
lead the congregation here. Come on up.
This is the way all churches work.
Right, exactly.
The front pew is always empty.
Some of you too back there. Come on.
Good. See, if you had come up,
come on.
if you had come up sooner, you could have gotten her autograph for that. So just a few words, and I'll finish. Boehner repeated just last week in his statement you heard right after the election this common ground. He used it three times. And he deliberately avoided using the term compromise, even though Obama sort of invited it by his speech the night before. So Boehner rejects compromise and what we call the classic compromise, which both sides really sacrifice things they really care about, because he doesn't want to acknowledge that he's going to have to give up something. The common ground is win-win. And that sounds a lot better, but that's also a lot harder to get. The common ground is often barren these days, at least in a pluralist democracy like ours. And the only way to make progress is the classic compromise, where everybody sacrifices something they think is valuable. Talking about the common ground just postpones the hard choices we have to make, and it sort of casts classic compromises in a bad light. It makes them look disreputable. So it is time for us to ask our representatives to get on with the business of governing, that is to say, compromising.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to. There's a lot packed into that, including the little skit that we saw in terms of the details of your argument. I hope we'll get to those. But I'd like to give Russ a chance to weigh in here. You're familiar with the argument. You know what's going on at the moment in the fiscal crisis that we may be facing. Just some observations that you have about the argument in light of the current environment that we're in.
It does seem that the occasion of the moment makes compromise necessary. The constitutional system is inviting it right now, with the parties splitting control of the Senate and the House. It seems to be in the interests of the major players. Congressional Democrats have an interest in compromising because they're in the minority. Obama has an interest in some sort of compromise because his legacy probably depends on that. The Republicans also seem to acknowledge, as you pointed out, Dennis, over the last 7 days, there's been some acknowledgement that certain compromises might be in the interest of the Republican Party. And Bill Kristol has mentioned that Republicans might endorse raising taxes on top earners. Looks like there could be compromise, or people have spoken, Republican leaders have spoken sympathetically about compromise on immigration. So there's an interest and there's an occasion. Will there be the work? Will there be an act of compromise? Could it actually happen? And one of the points of Amy and Dennis's book is that it's not enough to have an occasion that makes it necessary, and even an interest that makes it advantageous. There needs to be something else, what they call a mindset. The major players need to have a mindset of compromise. And that mindset refers to a set of a kind of a cluster of attitudes and an orientation. There's this great line in the book, Santayana, I think, says that compromise is sort of noxious to passionate natures because it's a surrender, and it's odious to intellectual natures because it seems like such a confusion. But compromise is attractive, if not to intellectuals and passionate movement fighters. It's attractive to pragmatic types, to governing people who have a statesmanlike or governing sensibility. And that's what we need for it to happen. And the question is, will that compromising mindset make itself known over the next month and 2 or 3 months? The mindset is not, as I understand it, the result of calculation. You don't think your way into the compromising mindset by noticing that it's to your advantage to compromise. It's better to get half a loaf than none. So it seems to be more like a virtue in that you acquire it by doing it or by practicing it. And there hasn't been a lot of practice. These people haven't gotten a lot of practice lately. So that's what makes me less than fully optimistic about the next month and 2 months. I don't know if this compromising mindset how to generate it when it hasn't already been, it's not already in abundant evidence. How to find it when it's not already there. And there's one element of it that I find really intriguing, which is what they call mutual respect. It's an obvious idea, but it means something really subtle and elusive with reference to politics and compromise. Mutual respect in everyday life is relatively basic, and we can have it for people we don't know as long as we don't treat them very badly. I could say we're respecting them, but it means something different in politics. It involves having being willing to place a value, or being able to appreciate your political opponents, and communicating that you can appreciate your political opponents. And I imagine it's awfully hard to appreciate the person who is trying to defeat you and your party in the next election, who's going to exaggerate your defects and distort your successes. How do you respect such a creature? But I suppose it has to start somewhere. And so I guess if I were to think of the most important thing that one person in power might do over the next month, is to somehow communicate mutual respect for their political opponents. I don't know, it may be just as too naive to suppose that speaking well of your opponents would be a start, but maybe a certain kind of speech about your opponents would be a start. It doesn't seem that you have to mean it. Just recently, I lost yet another argument to my wife, who's very good at arguing. I've never win those, and I think she felt a little bad after the argument that it's so easy to defeat me. So she said, she said something like, "Was that uncharming? Was that just not very charming?" And I said, "Well, it could have been more charming." She said, "How?" And I said, "Well, you could just say, that you could just say you're so smart and handsome."
And so wrong.
And she said, "But you're not." And I said, "It's okay. You could just say it. It doesn't have to be true." And maybe that's what we need, some just nice speech that isn't entirely true.
There you go.
Great. Thanks, Russ. Bill, you both write about, think about the normative and ethical implications of these things, but you've also been in the trenches on this. What are your thoughts on the current state of compromise?
Well, first of all, and I hadn't planned to do this, I want to defend Speaker Boehner a little bit, because he knows perfectly well what he's doing. He is functioning in a milieu where he can only execute a classic compromise if he refuses to admit that that's what he's doing, right? And so from his standpoint, he has no choice but to go through those elaborate verbal evasions. Because if he admits that what he's engaged in is a process of classic compromise, he will lose his political permission to engage in the process. That's politics, right? And the idea that transparency and compromise go together is one that you reject in your book, and quite rightly. And I think in Boehner's case, obfuscation, he thinks, is the necessary condition of a classic compromise, and I think he's right about that, given the milieu in which he's functioning. But let me be a little bit more analytical, and in so doing, I'm going to radicalize the problem, because I think that although the book is admirably realistic about where we now are, it perhaps is not realistic enough. And so let me try to say why. There are two kinds of easy compromise that are no longer quite appropriate to our circumstances. One form of easy compromise is the log roll, okay? I don't care about your bridge, and you don't give a damn about my dam, but, but we agree to support one another's objective. And that works when you're talking about a positive sum fiscal situation, right? You can, you don't have to choose between the two. You can just add them up. We are no longer in that situation. We can no longer just add things up, right? We have hit a fiscal wall. Indeed, we have flattened our heads against that fiscal wall. We can't do that anymore. And so we're not talking the language of addition now. We're talking the language of subtraction. And in those circumstances, the classic log roll becomes almost impossible. Here's another form of easy compromise that we really can't engage in anymore, okay? I think that we ought to spend $50 million on a line item. You think we ought to spend $100,000. And after we glare at each other across the table for a while, we split the difference. But that presupposes that we agree on the fundamental sense of direction, and the only question is how far, how fast. That condition is no longer satisfied either. So you can forget about log rolls, you can forget about split the difference. Those forms of compromise are no longer appropriate to our circumstances, and they simply won't work. What we're faced with now is the necessity of hard compromise. And let me define hard compromise in terms that are compatible with the definition of compromise offered in the book, but not quite the same. Somewhat darker formulation. A hard compromise occurs when all parties to the discussion accept a package with elements that each party to the discussion regards as bad and perhaps even immoral public policy. Bad and perhaps even immoral. That's a hard compromise. Okay, now, My thesis is that we're now in a situation where only hard compromises will allow us to make progress. Now, why is that? There's no single answer to that question, but I'll offer one nonetheless, perhaps because it's the subject that I've spent nearly 7 years working on at Brookings. Okay, during the past 50 years, we have moved from the politics of consensus to the politics of polarization. And there are features of the politics of polarization that necessitate hard compromise. And let me just focus on one, although there's a long list of them. The collapse of common frames of reference. Okay, 49 years ago, I left high school and entered, freshman year at college. And 49 years ago, in fiscal policy, we had two Keynesian political parties. We had an open-handed Keynesian party and a cheap Keynesian party, but we had two Keynesian parties, and the issue was quantitative rather than qualitative. Richard Nixon famously said, 8 years after I entered Cornell University, we're all Keynesians now, and the owl of Minerva, as usual, flapped its wing at dusk, because 7 years after Nixon made that remark, we no longer had two Keynesian political parties. We had a Keynesian party and a supply-side party, and we have ever since. Now, why does that matter? Because if you have two fundamentally different theories, then you have two accounts of how the world works. Right? You no longer agree on means-ends relationships, even if you agree on the ends. Right? If you have two Keynesian parties, then there is rough and ready agreement on means, ends, instrumental relationships. We do not have that anymore. One party now says that if you cut taxes, revenues go up. The other party says if you cut taxes, revenues go down. What's the next sentence in that conversation? Right? That's the first problem with the collapse of common frames of reference, which, by the way, has occurred in the area of foreign policy and social and cultural policy as well. And if we were having a different discussion, I'd walk you through the collapse of common frames of reference across the board in the past 50 years of American politics. But it's worse than not agreeing on instrumental relationships. The two political parties no longer agree on the fundamental goals that we seek, unless by fundamental you rise to such a level of abstraction that it becomes feel-good rhetoric rather than operational political language. One political party wants to defend what I'll call the entitlement state, the state that we began to construct during the New Deal and continued to construct during the Great Society and may have topped off during the first 2 years of the Obama administration. The other political party substantially wants to dismantle it. One political party believes that that there is no choice, that government as a share of gross domestic product must increase over historical levels. The other believes just the reverse. At the level of operational politics, there has been a collapse of agreement not only on instrumental relationships, but also on what John Dewey would have called, the ends in view. And so, what does that mean? What it means is that getting to yes, avoiding the fiscal cliff, just for starts, and that's only a way station on the road to a much broader and more fundamental agreement, is going to be incredibly difficult. And let me just give you a few reasons why, and then I'll subside. The co-authors of this book emphasize that you can't have a compromise unless certain conditions are satisfied, the most fundamental of which is that the compromise has to represent an improvement over the status quo from both points of view. But I can tell you that there is no agreement on the question of whether going over the cliff represents a decline from the status quo or not. And that makes it very difficult for the argument to move to the second stage. Now, I could pile complexity on complexity by saying that there's some disagreement, at least within my own party, the Democratic Party, on whether going over the cliff would represent an improvement, over the status quo or not. And let me just mention two other problems that obstruct getting to yes. Not only does a compromise have to represent an improvement over the status quo, but both parties must believe that there has been a reasonably, or at least roughly fair division of the benefits of the cooperation that's required in compromise. And that goes both on the level of substance and in politics on the level of political credit and blame, right? If one party believes that a particular compromise will redound to the political benefit of the other side more than itself, that the president will get credit for having engineered, having pulled a compromise rabbit out of the polarization hat, well then, the Republicans will say, regardless of the substance of the matter, we are getting the short end of the stick. There isn't a fair division of the benefits of cooperation because part of the political definition of benefit is public credit, as opposed to
Bill,
public blame.
this is, I think, you're getting to a fundamental point here, and I had another start-off question to get us going, but I'd like to use that, if that's okay.
All right, fair enough.
Because
I just about reached the end of my remarks anyway.
Amy and Dennis's thoughts on that particular critique, because it seems to me to be really a fundamental one, though I can see ways in which your argument actually addresses that. And so if you'd like to enter that conversation, and Russ, if you have things to throw in as well, that'd be great.
I think this sets, both what Russ and Bill said, and I'll take off from what Bill said, but address some of what Russ said too, is really important, because the last thing in the world that we would want to suggest is that getting to a compromise now is easier, other than hard. And for many of the reasons Bill said, although I would point out, just because Bill went back 49 years, when both parties were Keynesian, but the time of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, Ronald Reagan was not a Keynesian, and he campaigned, and what the Reagan Revolution stood for is that when you cut taxes, revenues go up, and the Democrats stood for when you cut taxes, revenues go down. And yet, despite that polarization, because of other factors, including that the Tip O'Neill and Reagan knew what it was like to have a compromising mindset, and there were relationships then in Congress, a tax reform was concluded, and it was very hard. Reagan didn't campaign on it, which is really important, and it just shows that even when it's really hard, and it was a hard compromise. It was not a log roll. The marginal rates went down on the wealthy, which symbolically and really for the Democrats is anathema, and taxes on the rich went up, which is symbolically and philosophically anathema to the Republicans. So let me just set a slightly different stage.
I have some things to say about that now.
Yes, there are other things we both, but look, here's what I would like to do, because what Bill did is set the stage for why it will be very difficult to compromise. And the theme of our book is, compromise is very difficult in a democracy. Having a democracy without compromise is impossible. And it is true that going off the fiscal cliff is perfectly okay, or at least okay, to the left wing of the Democrats and the right wing of the Republicans. The right wing is slightly or significantly larger than the left wing, although the left wing of the Democrats has been emboldened. But the vast majority of Americans want their politicians to compromise, and the vast majority of Americans have said, even faced with the question, do you want the politicians you favor the most to give in something that you care about to get a compromise. Faced with a debt ceiling crisis, yes. And faced with the fiscal cliff, which is far worse than that now, the vast majority, if they've sent any messages, cooperate, get something done. So, and compromise was a dirty word before the election. So here's the way I'd like to just set the stage. If there ever were a time for a dramatic shift from the campaigning mindset to the governing mindset, it is now, as unpracticed as it's been in recent years. And the 2012 election is over, and the fiscal cliff is imminent. And this is something where Dennis and I are writing I've just finished an article for a volume Bill Galston is editing for Daedalus, where there is a term for what is, what is done, which is we need to aim, both parties, at the common good, which is different from common ground. You can have the common good without having common ground. And here's, I see Christine Bichieri here for our PP&E, politics, philosophy, and economics students. Here's why such a shift is possible, even, Russ, if their virtue is not at a high point, the virtue of compromise. How likely is a compromise in Washington versus going over the fiscal cliff? Well, I wouldn't bet a dime, let alone $10,000 is one of our, either way. But you know, bets at this point are really beside the point. What is really to the point is what politicians could do if they're not necessarily virtuous, but rational about the prospects of their party. So here's what I'd like you all to ask. Do you care, everyone needs to ask, do you care more about winning the next election or governing now? And just considering some reasonable answers to this question can give us, I think, some guidance and rational hope. If you're a Democrat and care more about winning the next general election, you may very well want the Republican Party to veer further right and become even more rigid. As Alan Simpson said, they're more rigid than a fireplace poker without the occasional warmth. And you might want them to be as rigid as could possibly be. That will consign the Republican Party to the dustbin of history at the presidential level. You just have to look at the demographics. Governing, however, for the Democrats will become a nightmare. So responsible Democrats should want to compromise and to see the Republicans compromise. And President Obama is no longer running for re-election, he's running for history. So that's, in very short, the Democratic story. Now here's the Republican story. If you're a Republican and you want to have a better chance at winning the next presidential election, you should want your party to compromise. You don't want your party to be defined as the party responsible for pushing the country over the fiscal cliff. You don't want your party to be viewed by the largest governing electoral demographic in the country, the largest growing electoral demographic in the country, Latinos, as blocking immigration reform, just to get us beyond the fiscal cliff. And you certainly don't want your party to be viewed by women as for freedom for heterosexual men only, and not for women to afford contraception or to have the right for equal pay for equal work. So there is, short of virtue in the just governing dynamics of our country, a golden opportunity for compromise by a certain kind of calculation. Will it happen automatically? Hell no. Is it easier for them just to do, to pander to their bases? Absolutely yes. The bases are more vocal than ordinary citizens. But it doesn't take, wisdom, and this goes to Russ, to recognize that you're elected to govern, and the fiscal cliff, the consequences of the fiscal cliff are dire. And by the way, if we go over it, the Democrats can be, and Republicans can be heroes in a way, but the right and left wing that think the consequences are not going to be dire are absolutely wrong, and the vast majority of people here. And I would conclude by saying what Ross, Santayana said, that compromise is not, intellectuals don't like compromise because of the incoherence of it. But this is a case where common sense really prevails, and most people, when faced with something like the fiscal cliff, really get it. So I think, I wouldn't bet on it, Michael, but I think it's more possible now than it was before the election.
Okay, good answer, good response. And Dennis or Russ, do you want to jump in on this?
We can move to whatever you would
Okay.
like.
Well,
Yeah, you want to
Yeah, go.
quickly kind of give your response to that, and then I'd like to move on to the
I'll
other
have to
things.
respond to him.
well, that sounds like a moderator's signal not to go there.
No, well, I mean, I actually think that this is in some ways fundamental. I mean, what I'm hearing is that there are three dimensions to what's going on. There's pragmatism, there's principle, and there's ideology. And those three things need to be more or less aligned for it to work. I want to follow up in ways that I think, Bill, will allow you to continue this conversation. But
Right.
one issue that comes to mind is what's driving this. And I know that in the book, what's driving it at heart is the way in which campaigns currently work. But at least as someone who's interested in this, as a citizen and as a researcher, but also is not as deeply engaged in what's happening as you all are, it is my sense sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that you have leaders who actually may not be as philosophically at odds, caught in the trap of feeling as if they need to be that way in order to succeed pragmatically. So when the exchange that was just reenacted took place, the sense I got from that was that the issue was not, I don't believe in compromise. It was, I can't say I believe in compromise. And you even described it that way, Bill.
I did.
So for your argument to be right or as threatening, it's got to be that these deep-seated disagreements in means are as deep-seated as you described. And you would know, you're engaged in it. But how deep-seated do you think those really are? I mean, is it as two different worldviews as you've described?
Look, let me give you my unified field theory of American politics very briefly. I think in the past 50 years, to restate my topic sentence, we've shifted from the politics of consensus that the American Political Science Association so deplored that it deployed its best minds to destroy it, and beware what you wish for.
Though I think political science can take no credit for it happening.
Well, it certainly, there was certainly no resistance to it from the political science profession toward a more responsible two-party system.
Sure, yeah.
In plain English, that means a more differentiated and more polarized two-party system, one that gives you a choice and not an echo. If you remember that slogan.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Well, and you remember who articulated it. And in circumstances of polarized politics, even leaders who know better, are at the mercy of the people of the people that they're allegedly in charge of. And I think if I had time, I could describe the excruciating pressures that are already building on both Speaker Boehner and President Obama, from the most vocal and well-organized wings of their own party. And
Bill, could I just ask, just quickly?
Please.
I hear you describing the problem, and
Yes.
I don't think there's any big disagreement about the problem. But what's your solution? Because it can't. If it's hopeless.
no, I'm not saying.
I know you don't think it's hopeless. So because our democracy will be destroyed if the best minds, and I count you as among them, only describe the problem, right? It is. I agree that it's the problem, but what's the solution if not a classic compromise, which doesn't log roll and each side gives in something the way O'Neill and Reagan did.
Well, look, nobody can argue with the proposition that at the end of the day that's what needs to happen.
Okay.
The question is, what needs to happen before that can happen?
Okay.
Okay.
Fair enough.
And
But then we agree that needs to
Okay,
happen,
and-
which means the
Yeah.
two wings are irrelevant because they're not going to want it to happen.
okay, here are some of the conditions. Okay. My ideas. Okay. Number one, you need more of a constituency for compromise than now exists. That is a popular constituency for compromise. I've spent the past 2 years of my life helping to found a tripartisan organization called No Labels, which some people in the room may have heard of. And we have come up with specific reform agendas, institutional reform agendas that, in our judgment, represent some of the necessary conditions for a different kind of politics, which is to say, I don't believe that you can change mindsets in politics without changing incentives in politics. I think changes of incentive come first, which means that the mix of public voices needs to change. There needs to be as much of a mass movement for compromise, in my judgment, as there are mass bases for polarization. So that's one answer. That's one answer to your question. Here's another answer to your question, which I think you and Dennis have already anticipated. And that is, for at least a brief shining moment, we need a form of politics that is less democratic with a small d. Let me read a line which I believe is a line from your book, and a very relevant one. Quote, "If the deficit and related entitlement programs are to be addressed, it may well have to be in spite of public opinion, not in response to it." I think that was your line. And what that means is that the President and Speaker Boehner have to be prepared to join hands and jump together, despite the fact that the public ground has not yet been prepared for what they're going to agree to. And that's a really fundamental point. You say elsewhere in your book that the American people are in favor of compromise, but not compromises. And I think you both know that there's a wealth of survey evidence, including a recent survey by Andy Kohut, on the fact that the American people want a fiscal compromise, but they reject every single element of that compromise. Right? So, the political leaders are being asked to make bricks without straw. And the only way you can do that is by ignoring the people in the name of the common good, rightly understood. That's tough. And which brings me to my third point, and then I'll shut up. It may require some external forcing mechanism. I've been spending a lot of time the past week talking to economists, and some of them believe that if we go off the cliff, the reaction from the markets at home and abroad will be so adverse that the political system may be forced to come to its senses, however temporarily. There has been no external action forcing mechanism, and we may need one. So those are 3 answers to your question.
Good answers, but a couple of problems. One, you, despite appearing in the guise of a more realistic politician, you've actually now, with this last point, Bill, become another example in our pantheon of people looking for escapes. First, the election was going to be the forcing moment that would solve the problem. It hasn't. Now, going over the cliff will be. And I think, or the mass movement, which you've started, but we haven't yet. It's a long term. It's more of the order of, we have a section on civic education, which we all believe in, but that's not going to bring about the mass support and change the incentives. At least education doesn't work that fast. So that's also kind of grasping at the future. or an external force. So it does, and then you say join hands and resist and take a risk for Boehner and Obama and some of the other leaders. And I think actually that's right. But that sounds like a mindset to me. Without the incentives, except Obama cares about history, and Boehner, I think, despite my inadequate portrayal of him, is actually a good person who wants to do the right thing and is caught in this. But the two of them, with some other leaders, maybe if they put themselves in the right frame of mind, could pull this off. If they don't, then Amy's question remains.
I'm hoping that the two of them, with respect to the next month, that somehow those two personalities
the
might
incentives are
revive
not going to change.
something from
By
the
your own
summer.
account, they're not going to
It's not
change.
going to be just the president and Boehner. If it's going to happen, this is really a serial thing. There were incentives for the super committee to come to an agreement, but they were too far in the future. The fiscal cliff was too far away. Now the fiscal cliff is imminent, and a lot of the American public are aware of it and are being made aware of it, even though they don't know all of its ins and outs. And virtually every responsible economist will tell you we will go into a double-dip recession if we go over the fiscal cliff. Now, how long we'll go into it, don't know, but we will go over it. We will be downvalued again as a country. And so now there's the fiscal cliff, and the politicians know about it, and many more Americans know about it, and many more Americans have spoken up in exit polls in the election and so on that they want cooperation. If that doesn't create an incentive for compromise, which we're prescribing it should, and I think everybody here believes it should, then we will go over the fiscal cliff, and the incentives will be even greater, but the consequences could be likely to be even more dire,
Might be
at
like
least in the short run. I've never been somebody to believe that our ability to predict as human beings is so great that we should be able to say it's got to get that much worse in order to get better. Because it doesn't have to get that much worse in order to get better if not only Boehner and Obama, but there's a gang of 6 in the Senate. There are many people. That's why I tried to sketch out, apropos of economists, that there are incentives right now in place for politicians who don't want Congress's popularity to go to zero, which is what it will do.
So
Congress will have zero support. Maybe just their friends and relatives. Maybe that's a template.
So Russ wanted in on this. I mean, I don't know whether you were able to make
But
a point,
a
Russ,
footnote just to this, just so it doesn't get
So
lost.
Russ, if you wanted to continue your thought. No, okay. All right, so Dennis, and then I'd like to open it up for
Yeah,
at least 15 minutes to this.
let's don't forget that opinion and mass movements are actually quite malleable and shifting. During the, and they may yet shift, as Amy pointed out, during the crisis over the possible government default in summer 4, a little noticed fact, a substantial majority of Tea Party supporters favored a compromise that would include the tax increase that they had just elected people pledged not to do. When they saw, and the government default is a much less threatening thing than what we're facing now, they were prepared to give their leaders, their representatives, the flexibility to make the right decision. That could happen now. I mean, I think it's an excuse that politicians appeal to that probably is, we don't have the incentives because we'll lose. That probably is not as plausible as they think it is.
So let's give the audience a chance to jump in here for at least a few minutes. So yes, please. Please identify yourself when you...
Use the mic, John.
Oh, okay. Hello, Mike. So there's another arena of hard compromise that I think Amy and Bill alluded to that's going on now within the Republican Party that may or set the predicate for the legislative compromise that you've been talking about. And I want to get the panel to respond to what's going on within the party right now, which I think is equally fascinating. In the last 7 days, ideological social conservatives like Mike Huckabee and Yuval Levin have said there are certain moral issues about which we cannot compromise with our fellow Republicans.
Yeah.
If you take immigration off the table and gay marriage, which they have not wanted to talk about, what you happen to be left with, no special pleading for the field I work in, bioethics, they're mostly the bioethical issues. They're abortion, assisted death, stem cell research, and related manipulations of human reproductive capacities in the laboratory. Meanwhile, there are people who actually have to govern, like governors and mayors, who are saying, well, you know, we think we may need to change our tone on this question. Unless that happens, it is less plausible for the kind of compromise that the panel is discussing, it seems to me, for that to happen. So that is really a question of moral compromise. And as Huckabee said, this is who we are. We can't give ground on this, even to our fellow Republicans who may want to change the message, change the tone in order to reach out to these new voters and these ethnic groups that we're not reaching.
Thoughts on that, or?
There are more or less clumsy ways, I guess, of applying matters of principle in policy, and sometimes where it seems like in the abstract there's no possibility for compromise in practice. I mean, Bill, you've observed in serving in office essentially that there are many occasions for people of rival moral views to agree on particular policies in spite of their more abstract disagreement.
So let me.
In the case of
yeah.
the abortion, funding abortions in the Affordable Health Care Act, you've chronicled how it's possible to find compromises in spite of
Senator Casey.
So let me dare into the territory that is John raises. That's really hard to dare. Abortion. So the right wing of the Republican Party says that's not a place to compromise. However, did anyone notice that the vice presidential candidate for the Republicans immediately gave up his principled rejection of abortion in the case of rape and incest in order to join another pro-life Republican, but there was a compromise of principle there. He said, I will retract it, I will run with Mitt Romney, on Mitt Romney's view. People do not go into politics because they're unwilling to compromise their principles. They don't want to compromise their principles. We want politicians who resist it if not necessary. But politics is the realm in which if there's any realm where principles are, as Dennis and I argue, guideposts, not roadblocks, it's politics. And that's the way it should be, because you're not representing just yourself, you're representing a diverse country. So I found the most interesting thing, and I'd be interested in other people's view on this, is of late there's a view that the Republicans roughly can be divided into the media types, like Huckabee, who are really pushing to the right, and the more establishment political Republicans, there are exceptions to this, who are looking to compromise. And I think there's a real, Jonathan, you're right, there's a real fight between them. And I can say I totally agree with Bill's view that be careful what you wish for. We need a moderate Republican Party in this country. The Democrats who want the Republicans, who would be happy for the Republicans to go right so they could, obliterate themselves, are not wishing for the right thing. And so I think there's the makings of a coalition between those Republicans who want to move the party more to the center and Democrats who are willing to compromise.
Well, that may be right, but here's a caveat. You need hard compromise when two conditions are satisfied. Number one, the parties are deeply divided, But number two, they're narrowly divided. And in 1936,
I don't think that's right, Bill.
well, let me tell you why. In 19
Reagan and O'Neill were not narrowly divided.
I have something to say about
Okay.
that too. Okay, but let me give you the example of 1936. Okay, there were vast differences between the Franklin Roosevelt Democratic Party and the Alf Landon Republican Party, but Roosevelt and the Democrats didn't have to care what the rump of the Republican Party thought about anything. I mean, they had to talk among themselves, but that was it. And I can assure you that there are at least some Democrats who continue to hope that the Republican Party will marginalize itself in such a way that makes a Democratic supermajority possible, in which case, if you hold out long enough, you don't have to compromise.
That's right. yeah.
So, that's what I mean when I say
Absolutely.
now. But let's.
And they're living in a fantasy world.
Well, I agree with that, but
So?
but there are lots of okay. But let's talk about the 1986 tax reform, since it's a case study that you put on the table. I disagree with your history of that in two respects. First of all, there was a substantial intellectual infrastructure in the Democratic Party, led by Bill Bradley and Dick Gephardt, that had fleshed out the basic terms of the 1986 tax reform years before Ronald Reagan embraced that architecture. That's a fact.
We
right?
don't disagree with that.
Okay,
Yeah, sort of like healthcare was
you know,
already
okay,
for
but
Bob
number
Dole.
okay, but
Don't
you know,
disagree with that at
so
all.
there was
Totally consistent
there
with
was a
our
shared intellectual framework. But number two, it is not the case that Ronald Reagan didn't tee up the issue. He most certainly did. In his 1984 State of the Union, right, he explicitly said, this is going to be one of the centerpieces of my second term if I get one. He ordered his Treasury Secretary to produce a plan. And so are we,
I don't understand what we're disagreeing about, frankly.
Well-
The Simpson Bowles has been, we have teed up Simpson Bowles. There was many Republicans as Democrats, and a majority, not a super, but 11 members of Simpson Bowles teed that up. There is teed up the makings, just as what Bradley teed up bore very little resemblance to what came out. What comes out of a compromise is going to only bear a rough resemblance to Simpson Bowles, but it's teed up.
Okay, so I would like to,
Okay.
I mean,
Gonna
this is
stand down.
really interesting to those of us who are like political junkie
Right,
nerds.
exactly.
But I'd like to also get some of the larger issues
Right.
out. So anyone else in the
And we
audience?
confess to being
Yeah,
that.
we have a comment right in the back there.
My name is Ernie Falcone, Felt School of Government. I think there's a historical precedent to what's going on, and it's very recent history, and that could be as recent as 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a face down. The Kennedy administration realized that they had to get Khrushchev to blink, and that they were willing to give concessions by dismantling some outdated nuclear weapons in Turkey. So that was the compromise. The problem here is that Wall Street is already telegraphing a disaster. Washington works in slow ways, 11:45, 12 o'clock compromise, and Wall Street is saying that that doesn't work here. So that's the difficulty. You're already seeing lots of fallout, and what we're hoping for is that Washington can get an agreement together before the 12th hour.
Absolutely good observation
Yeah.
on that, I think.
And
any-
it may just kick the can down the road, but it'll still need a compromise and a classic compromise to do that, which will buy more time. It may not, in which case
Yeah,
we'll
there
go
won't
over the
be
cliff.
I don't think anybody thinks there's going to be a tax reform and a comprehensive grand bargain before January 1st, or even in the first 3 months. But there will, we hope, maybe some of our friends on the left and the right don't hope, that there will be some kind of agreement that will reassure the markets enough and will not send us immediately into a recession.
So let's take one
could I
more
just-
question. I'll give you a
Could I-
chance to.
well, just to be a short,
Absolutely, yeah.
a short
Go ahead.
comment
Go
to
ahead,
this
Bill.
point.
Yeah.
I note for the record that Kennedy refused to admit publicly that he had given anything to the Russians.
Right. Yeah.
Right? In other words, the condition, the condition of the quid pro quo, the Turkish missiles, was that Kennedy refused to acknowledge that for quite some time, despite the fact that he was asked explicitly at more than one press conference.
Right.
And that's fine. I mean, you don't
Yeah, I
have to.
agree. Yeah.
You don't have to admit that you're compromising. You just have to do it.
One more question or comment from the audience, and then I think we're going to need to do some last-minute wrap-ups here. So we got it over here, sorry.
Hi, my name is Jesus Perez. I'm in the freshman class, and this is a slight deviation from the general elections, slight overshadowed issue, which relates to Puerto Rico. I'm from Puerto Rico, right? And so recently we had a plebiscite, and the people voted for statehood. And however, the people of Puerto Rico ousted the pro-statehood governor and instead elected a pro-Commonwealth governor. So here's an issue of compromise. And what do you think are some issues facing the incoming governor in terms of compromise, given that the will of the Puerto Rican people is fundamentally different from his party's and his own personal views?
Yeah, I don't know whether, I mean, you're welcome to. I'm not sure we have experts on that particular issue on the panel.
We're experts on everything, but we know also we know when not to comment.
Okay.
Alas,
Actually, I am going to use the moderator's prerogative to have one last question, because I was looking in the wrong direction. So Kathleen, if you have a question or comment that you'd like to make.
80 corporate leaders signed a statement in the last week of October calling for compromise. I read them to say that we can't go into another S&P downgrade situation, and as a result, they said that they needed revenue on the table and spending cuts, and when specifically asked whether that included tax increases, one of their leaders said yes. I wonder if the answer to one of these questions about how you get to compromise is you get in such a dire situation that a natural constituency of one side calls for it to make a concession that otherwise it would feel constrained not to make.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And since we're at the end of our time, I just want to, before Michael, if there's going to be a manifesto for your new movement, Bill, let it be the spirit of compromise.
Well,
seriously. And I just wanted to, since money didn't come up but barely in this, I don't know, and this I have even less hope for than I do for compromise, but one of the causes we say in the book of the uncompromising mindset is the unlimited flow of money into politics. And one of the best paraphrases of Churchill lately that I think just resonates so well with what happened in the presidential election is that never have so few spent so much to achieve so little. So may there be, I don't hold out opportunities for there to be a lesson, but it's something that we should take to heart.
So we do have a minute, but only a minute or two. So if anyone wants to make last comments on the panel, and then I'll just want to say a couple of words, and then we can break to the reception to continue the conversation.
One last comment. The only quote that, the only authority that might top what Amy just quoted would be the Beatles, whom we do quote the Beatles in the book. And this goes directly to something Bill and Russ were saying earlier. One of the things one might hope, and we've heard a lot, to make compromise more possible would be institutional reform, change the incentives. And we have a whole chapter about institutional reform. But the trouble is, there's a catch-22. In order to get institutional reform, you need a compromising mindset. It's just as hard, maybe harder, to reform the institutions as it is to get past legislation. So that's why the Beatles had it right, remember? You say it's the institution, well, no, free your mind instead. They should have said mindset, but it didn't make the rhyme. So free your mind.
well, this actually gets to, I think, a fundamental analytical difference. We've already talked about a little bit, and that is, I happen to believe that it is if we're going to avoid the fiscal cliff sometime in the next 6 weeks, it will be because of the anticipation of dire consequences if we don't,
Absolutely.
right? And and so I think the only thing that will allow us to avert it is a shared fear by the two political parties that they don't really know what the consequences of going over would be, and maybe they don't want to take the chance despite the multiple temptations to do it. But that is my definition of an external event, the anticipation of an external event, producing a change of incentives within the political system, not a change of mindset.
Yeah, that's one.
But that's not analytically,
This will be your final comment.
right. The external event has to cause a change in the mindset. It won't do it automatically. People have to sit down and compromise. It's not an automatic. There is no machine that's going to do it for it. It's going to be the
And I never said there was, but
And-
only
and-
that the change
and
of
this is
mindset
not
will
an-
be
Let Russ-
produced.
let's let
It's
Russ
not
get
an
it.
event that
Let's let
happens.
Russ get his
It's
final
an event
words in
that
here.
doesn't
Let Ross
happen.
get in.
Well,
Another, principles are hard to compromise, but interests are easier to broker. And another great quote from the book is that the genius of American politics is that it can convert matters of principle into conflicts of interest. And I think that's the genius that we're going to somehow need to rediscover.
Dennis, any last words?
Yeah, that's.
So I just want,